The story I'm going to tell you today comprises only a few lines in one of the greatest historical value works of the 13th century, the Joinville Chronicles. One of the most prominent chroniclers of the Crusades, Jean de Joinville, left us his memoirs, dedicated to the life of Saint Louis, a biography of King Louis of France, a Catholic monarch, devoted husband, father of 11 children, and a holy crusader. So, in his memoirs, Joinville tells a story about seeing a cart with 3 dead sergeants and asking the Provost of Paris about what had happened. Provost of these times would be an administrator of the city that included the police management, appointed by a king.
And the Provost told him that the dead men were 3 of his sergeants of the Châtelet who had gone into unfrequented streets to rob people.
On a side note, let me remind you that most of the people of that sort of job, like, let's say, proto-policemen, were hired from different places and therefore had no ties with local folks. That would ensure that law enforcers had no influence from family or friends within the city walls. However, that would promote somewhat animosity toward locals and sometimes criminal behaviors among medieval constables. And that is what we are witnessing in the story. The sergeants robbed a clerk of all his clothes. Let me remind you about who were clerks. Overall, that title belonged to clergymen, usually very educated members of religious order. They kept archives updated and were officials, secretaries, tax collectors, missionaries, and public servants. Just picture it yourself. 3 policemen, well armed, had found nothing to do but to rob a clerk, a clergyman, for God's sake. Well, you would say those clerks are fat little men who were always victims of robbery for their weakness of some kind, like we used to see them in movies. Right. The story goes on.
The clerk, being only in his shirt, went to his home, took his crossbow, and ordered a child to bring his falchion. Then, when he saw those sergeants again, he cried out upon them and said they should die.
That may sound funny. You would immediately imagine that fat, weak clergyman frantically waving his falchion and crossbow in front of lightly armed and probably well-trained sergeants. But here we stick to reality. The clerk drew his crossbow and shot and pierced one of the men through the heart. The 2 others made off flying.
And the clerk took the falchion which the child handed to him and followed them in the moonlight, which was fine and clear.
Okay, now we see a different and very terrifying picture. Creepy moon over a night city, a man in just a shirt with real deadly weapons in his hands, using them with skills of a well-trained mercenary.
The one man thought to pass through a hedge into a garden, and the clerk struck him with his falchion and cut right through his leg, in such sort that it only holds to the boot. The clerk then followed the other, who thought to go down into a strange house, where the people were still awake. But the clerk struck him in the middle of the head with his falchion, so that he clove his head to the teeth.
Here the Provost continued.
Sire, the clerk showed what he had done to the neighbors in the street, and then came and made himself your prisoner. And now, sire, I have brought him to you to do with him what you will.
Rather dramatic story, but what was mostly touching in it was the ending, when the king expressed his decision. Here, he said,
Sir Clerk, you have forfeited your priesthood by your prowess, and for your prowess I take you into my service, and you shall go with me overseas. And this thing I do for you because I would have my men to fully understand that I will uphold them in none of their wickedness.
In short, my dear listeners, the king took the poor cleric with him to his 7th crusade. Well, not for his vigor and skills in killing people, but to pay for his sins, right? Why am I saying that story in my In Search of Lichtenauer series? For the mention of a fencer master named Hanko Dobringer with a curious nickname, Priest. The first and last mention of that name comes from Codex 3227a, where Master's Lichtenauer verses are scribed together with all sorts of other interesting information. One must note that Dobringer's name was omitted and then added later. That is why, somehow, the document is called the Dobringer manuscript as well. However, there were no mentions of him anywhere else in later documents. Some people thought that it could be simply due to a genuine connection to a weak, geek type of personality, as modern people are calling those who engage in the knowledge of technical things more than others, and therefore are not capable of defending themselves from physical abuse. Now, I hope that part we've cleared out. Well, I'll talk about it later. Have a nice day and see you soon with more stories in my In Search of Lichtenauer series.